Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for another live stream event by the Japan Information and Culture Center, Embassy of Japan. You are watching American Whiskey and Japanese Cherry Blossoms, the incredible, improbable life of Jokichi Takamine, presented by Stephen Lyman and followed by a special Q&A moderated by Christopher Pellegrini. Now, please welcome the director of the JICC for his remarks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being with us tonight. My name is Masashi Mizobuchi. I'm the director of JICC, Embassy of Japan. The seasons are changing, and here in DC, I am seeing beautiful flowers blooming. Irises, azaleas, kusa, dogwood, but everyone must agree that the flowers that mark the arrival of spring are cherry blossoms, which were gifted to Washington, D.C. from Japan. The last two seasons of cherry blossoms, despite the blossoms themselves being beautiful, were a little bit disappointing because we couldn't celebrate the two countries' friendship in person at the National Cherry Blossom Festival. I hope we'll be able to gather around next year under the cherry blossom trees. It may surprise you to learn that tonight's event's main topic, Takamine Jokichi, played a significant role in Japan's gifting of the cherry blossom trees. Takamine Jokichi is a legendary figure among Japanese communities in the United States. It is widely known that he contributed much to medical science. As many of tonight's audience know, the last decade and a half have been exciting years for Japanese whiskey makers on the international stage. I am curious to hear about how he is involved in the whiskey industry as well. Tonight's guest speakers, Japanese spirits specialists Stephen Lyman and Christopher Pellegrini, are both Japan Cool ambassadors and co-host a podcast called Japan Distilled. If you are interested in or would like to know more about Japanese drinks, their podcast is a wonderful wealth of knowledge. I am very excited to hear tonight's lecture and eager to learn more about the life of Takamine Jokichi. So without further ado, please welcome Stephen Lyman and Christopher Pellegrini.
Hello. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I am Stephen Lyman. I would like to introduce myself a little bit. I guess to set context for this presentation, I am not a historian. I am an author of The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I am a spirit specialist. And I am the co-host of the Japan Distilled podcast, along with Christopher Pellegrini, who you will meet later. But as a drinks writer and as a podcast host, I'm a storyteller. So I've done my research on Jokichi Takamine, and I'm telling his story as best I can, but I could not go back to original sources. So I'm relying on the research of others that I was able to find through my own research, predominantly online and in conversations with people who have gone deeper into his life in different aspects. So if there are any errors in my presentation, I do apologize. But those would be factual historical errors rather than his story. And I hope that I can really present his life in a way that brings his contribution to light and helps you understand just what an interesting and important man Jokichi Takamine was. So I'd like to begin with the year 1854. I was surprised at how many things of historical significance happened in this single 12-month period. Since we're speaking from the Japanese embassy in America, I think it would be important to note that the Republican Party was actually founded in 1854. Just a few days later, only 3 days later, 1 month and 3 days later, Commodore Perry opened Japan. This was a historic moment in which Japan, which had been closed for hundreds of years to external trade, opened up to the world for the first time in centuries. And actually, the first historical Black college was established in Pennsylvania, Lincoln College, that year. The U.S. Naval Academy graduated its first class, and the American accordion was patented. giving you a sense of how old that instrument is. And this was the year that Thoreau published Walton, which is obviously a significant work in American literature. And future President Abraham Lincoln began his political career with a speech in October of that year. Florence Nightingale was sent to the Crimean Front, and the charge of the Light Brigade happened. I thought that that was more of a story than a factual event, so I was interested to discover that that happened in this year. And the last important event of that year, which at the time nobody had any idea was important, was the birth of Jokichi Takamine. So we'll really focus on two of these events in this talk: Commodore Perry opening Japan and Jokichi Takamine's birth. And the reason this matters is if Commodore Perry had not opened Japan, Takamine's life would have been much different. We may have never heard of him. He may have lived in relative obscurity in Japan, in a closed country. Instead, the opening of Japan gave him an opportunity to realize his own hopes and dreams. Jokichi was born in Takaoka district of the Kaga domain, which is part of modern Toyama prefecture. And this is in central Japan. He was born to a samurai physician. His father was both of the samurai class, but also trained as a physician. And his mother came from a sake making family, which was a very prevalent occupation at the time, with sake being one of the predominant styles of alcohol available in closed Japan. Jokichi was the oldest of 13 children to these parents. Now, two key life influences. Obviously, our parents make a really big difference in how we see the world and what we become. His father being a physician and a samurai is truly important. And also the fact that his mother came from a sake making family would make a big difference in his life. And I hope that will become clear to you as we go through his life. Now, his father as a physician was a student of something called Rangaku, or Dutch learning, which was a term related to the study of Western science. So there was communication between the West and Japan through the port Dejima in Nagasaki city. But that was the only place in which the West could trade with or communicate with the Japanese. And it was actually a Dutch port. So it was Dutch traders who traded with Japan. And so Dutch learning started in Japan earlier than other parts, but that was really the Dutch introducing all sorts of Western science, technology, and that sort of thing. And his father was a student of that, even though he lived over 600 miles away from Nagasaki city. And the mother, coming from a sake making family, really helped Jokichi from a young age understand how mold and yeast could make alcohol, this chemical process. Now, at the age of 10, likely due to his father's influence, Jokichi was sent by the Kaga domain lord. This is still the age of the samurai. This is still before the fall of the old system. The Kaga domain lord sent Jokichi, along with other young promising students from the domain, to Nagasaki to study English and Western science. And he ends up living with a Portuguese family and studies English with them in Nagasaki, and he learns at Dejima, the Dutch port, the trading port. And in fact, Jokichi would end up speaking with a Dutch accent for the rest of his life. Now, to set, I know I'm saying set context a lot, but that's what I'm doing with these early slides. To go from Kaga to Nagasaki, this was over 600 miles for a 10-year-old at a time when most Japanese people would never leave their home domains. Their travel was restricted for the most part. And so to travel over 600 miles across, you can see nearly the length of, at least half the length of Japan. At this time, Hokkaido was just beginning to become part of Japan. It was a very rural area. That's the large island up to the north. So really, he traveled about half of the length of Japan to get to this educational opportunity in Nagasaki. Really remarkable. Now, in 1868, at the age of 13, which was the first year of the Meiji Restoration, this was the point. So this is 14 years after Commodore Perry opened Japan, the Japanese decided to begin reforms that would modernize the country extremely rapidly. And Jokichi is sent to Kyoto for military training and then Osaka for high school. So he begins high school at the age of 13 in Osaka after brief military training in Kyoto. Now, this is another big move for him. he moves from his hometown in Takaoka to Nagasaki and now to Osaka, where he continues his education. And he spends from 1869 to 1872 in Osaka. He actually, during this period, he enters the medical school, and he also studies college level chemistry at Osaka Chemistry School, and he continues his English education thanks to a scholarship from the Kago domain. And so he, again, is really embracing Western science, English, and modern medicine as his future. Obviously, again, probably very much due to his father's influence. He then moves in 1872 to Tokyo University, where he, at the age of 25, is in the first graduating class of Tokyo Engineering College. So there wasn't an opportunity to graduate before then because he was part of the first graduating class. Age 25 might seem old for modern people as far as an age at which to graduate from university, but it turned out he had such an excellent chemistry professor at the Osaka Chemistry School that he gave up on medicine due to his interest in chemistry, and he graduates with a degree in applied chemistry rather than in medicine. We have no idea how his father felt about that, but in Japan there's a long history of children doing what their parents told them to do, so this might have been a little bit rebellious on his part. So again, he had made another big move where he went from home to Nagasaki to Osaka and now to Tokyo. And that is actually a photo believed to be from 1872 of the Nihonbashi Bridge in central Tokyo. Obviously, things have changed a lot since that time. Also, during the time that he was living in Tokyo, to give you a sense of place and the sense of time, it was actually in 1873, a year after he arrived, that the samurai class was abolished. His father lost his title. He was no longer part of an elite class of warriors, but because his father was a physician, he could continue to earn a living for the family, while many samurai who were not trained in another specialty ended up being economically distressed, and that caused a number of rebellions as the Meiji Restoration continued. But fortunately for the Takamine family, they were okay. In 1876, the telephone was patented, and in 1879, Thomas Edison tested his first light bulb. So this is the time when Jokichi is growing up, a very rapid improvement in technology and communication worldwide. Again, he had shown so much promise as a graduate of Tokyo University, which today is the premier university in Japan, that he was offered a scholarship by the Japanese government. It's no longer the domain that's offering him his educational opportunities. It's actually the Japanese national government. He was given an opportunity to study abroad in industrial engineering, and he studied at Glasgow University, as well as at some other universities in the UK, to learn in Western industrial practices. Now, it's really interesting to me that he ended up at Glasgow University because Masataka Taketsuru studied at Glasgow University. He's considered the father of Japanese whiskey, but he wouldn't arrive in Glasgow for 35 more years. Takamine predated him by quite a bit of time. And there's actually another significant Japanese historical figure who spent most of his adult life in the United States, just as Jokichi Takamine did, Kanai Nagasawa, who was the first Japanese person to make wine in the United States. And he also studied in Glasgow. So there's clearly a strong connection between Glasgow and Japan in this period of history. After returning to Japan, Jokichi is appointed to the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce at the age of 28. And he's focused on modernizing Japanese industries using Western methods. And he chooses sake, traditional Japanese paper, and indigo dye making. Now, this wasn't an age of Japanese bureaucracy. This government was in its infancy. This modern government just hadn't existed a few years before. So Takamine actually set these as his goals himself. At the age of 28, he's deciding that he's going to use what he learned to modernize these three industries. And you see that sake is on the list, likely because his mother came from a sake making family. And in 1885, when he's just 30 years old, he's tapped to be the head of the patent office for Japan. So only 2 years after he starts his government service, and he helps establish the Japanese patent standards for the country. And again, he had studied these sorts of things overseas, so he was well equipped to do this. But stepping back a little bit, while he's still working for the department or for agriculture and commerce, he's sent as part of a Japanese delegation to the 1884 World's Fair in New Orleans. This is his first trip to America, and he probably had no idea at the time what a huge impact this trip would have on his life. But he meets 18-year-old Caroline Field Hitch while there, and his meeting, or the time that he spent with her, was actually documented, and it was the first time he was ever mentioned in an American newspaper, and it would certainly not be the last. They met at a soiree, and it was written up the day after the event, and this was really from the society section of the newspaper. This was the page 6 of the of the New York Post. It was fun. It was so that people could understand what the elites were doing. And the story read in part, "A very enjoyable affair was given last Thursday evening at the residence of Captain E.V. Hitch by a number of young gentlemen, in complement with charming young ladies who had a week previously acted as hosts. A party of young ladies and gentlemen chaperoned by Mr. and Mrs. Ralston of California witnessed the performance at the St. Charles Theater last Friday evening." Now, among the young ladies was Caroline, or as she was called in the article, Carrie Hitch. And you note that Captain E.V. Hitch hosted the encounter. So at their home may very well have been where they met. And then one of the gentlemen hosts was J. Takamine. And you see they misspell his name. It's not written Takamine, it's Takamine. This would be a recurring problem throughout his career in America, where his name would often be misspelled. And he is described as a distinguished Japanese nobleman now on a mission to the exposition. Now, he had just lost his noble status, but likely because of his education, his grasp of English, and the fact that he was an official government representative, and he may have still had a regal air to him, he was taken as a nobleman in this article, and very likely by the Hitch family, which may be part of why they were able to accept him as a potential suitor. But realistically, in the 1880s, how could this Japanese man marry a young American socialite? Their family were clearly well-to-do. His family was also well-to-do, but they're from different cultures, different sides of the world. And he may have been one of the first Asian people that these Americans had ever seen. This is very early days, especially at least one of the first Japanese people. There have been very few Japanese that had traveled to the United States at this time. So Jokichi returns to Japan with a dream. Somebody's clearly captured his attention, and he apparently had captured hers. So he returns to Japan, and he ends up taking leave from the Japanese government to go and establish Asia's first superphosphate company. And his first order is for 2,100 tons of U.S. fertilizer from a U.S. fertilizer company. And this really sets him on the path to economic stability and prosperity, which would follow him through businesses through the rest of his career. And the person who placed that order was actually somebody he had met in New Orleans at the World's Fair. So in 1887, they are married. It's again written up in the society section of the Daily Picayune in August. A brilliant wedding, the sequel to a happy love affair. So they had been courting remotely for about 3 years, and they were finally able to be married in New Orleans. And they end up honeymooning in the US. And this gives you a sense of him. He hasn't seen his new bride in 3 years. There's no evidence that he traveled back to the States in between meeting her for the first time and them getting married. But they spent their honeymoon visiting fertilizer factories and studying American patent law, which must have been thrilling for her. But she clearly understood who he was and how ambitious he was and what he was trying to do, and she supported him in that throughout their life together. She ends up moving to Japan that same year. On the ship, the sailing vessel trip home, Jokichi develops serious liver illness and nearly dies. And Carolyn helps nurse him back to health. And fortunately, he does recover. But this would be a chronic illness that would plague him for the rest of his life periodically. They end up very quickly having two sons, Jokichi Jr. and Ebenezer, which I think is an adorable name. And but they didn't stay in Japan long. Actually, Jokichi's mother-in-law, Caroline's mother, convinces them to return to the United States because she has business opportunities for them. She believes that he can be successful with some of the technology that he's been developing as an applied chemist to have a life in the States, and then she can be close to her grandchildren. So they decide to do that. And in 1890, so 3 years after they were married, they moved to Chicago and they established the Takamine Ferment Company, where he develops a digestive aid using koji amylase. So let's just go back for a second. His father's a physician. His mother works for a sake-making family. He's developing medicine, so that ties in with the physician. But what is koji amylase? So this was actually an article that was written up about him shortly after he started his company. He had a chemistry lab in Peoria, Illinois. In fact, they established the company in Chicago, but they were living in Peoria. And here it says he's busy. The Japanese chemist Jokichi Takamine, again misspelling his name, is busy testing his patented diastase starch-eating koji amylase to make products. He has already patented a new process in Europe and America. So what is koji amylase? This is where we get into the science part of his life and try to understand a little bit better what he was doing, because he was Japanese and bringing Japanese technology to the West. So to understand koji or koji amylase, we actually have to jump back 1,300 years. So well before Takamine. This is the Asuka period in the 500s to 700s AD. This is European early Dark Ages. This is Roman Empire time. Buddhism had arrived from China, and Prince Shotoku drafts the first constitution of Japan. It's still a constitution based on royalty, but laws are put into place to put boundaries on what people are allowed to do. And this is also the time when koji is introduced to Japan. So how was koji introduced? And we'll get to what koji is, but the romantic story would be that it was discovered by a Japanese farmer who found koji growing on rice in his fields. But in reality, most likely it was actually an imported product from China, which had already been using koji in food and alcohol fermentations. Remember, Buddhism came from China. There was a robust trade between China and Japan at that time. And koji is a mold that's native to Asia and actually other parts of the world. But in Chinese fermentation, their koji is introduced to Japan through what we would call in English, I guess, yeast balls is the easiest description I've heard of them. And this is a very common Chinese fermentation method even today. And these juchu, or Chinese yeast balls, are full of all sorts of organisms. These are like microbiomes almost. These little balls of molds, all sorts of yeasts, all sorts of bacteria. When laboratory analyses have been done on these things, they're just teeming with all sorts of different things, and all of these things work together to create Chinese fermentation. Now, in Japan, in sake fermentation, which actually started not long after koji was introduced, rather than using all of those molds, yeasts, and bacteria, the Japanese sake makers, which were actually Buddhist monks in the early days, ended up identifying a single mold, a single yeast, and a single bacteria in order to make sake. So it became much more refined in the fermentation style, much cleaner, much less risky, because once you harness these three organisms, you could consistently make sake, and each of these organisms served a different purpose. So Aspergillus oryzae is the mold which breaks starches into sugars. This mold actually eats starch, and in doing that, it breaks those starches into sugars. And then yeast, which is used for every kind of alcohol production ever, converts sugars to alcohol. And so the mold breaks down the starches so that the yeast can eat the sugars, because yeast cannot eat starch. Starch is too long a complex carbohydrate chain for the yeast to eat. So the mold and the yeast work together to convert starches into sugars. And then the other thing is that if you want to have a consistent fermentation, you'd need some acidity to protect the mold and the yeast while they do their jobs. So lactobacillus creates natural lactic acid, which fights off other organisms that might want to corrupt the fermentation, might want to get in there and join the party and eat some of those starches or sugars. And so in traditional sake making, this mold, yeast, and bacteria all work together in the fermentation to make sake. So Aspergillus oryzae, which is the technical name, is actually a very common strain of koji, and it's what's used today to make almost all sake in Japan, even today. And koji has been used by Japanese to make what is pretty close to modern sake since the 700s. There's a 1,300-year tradition of making sake in Japan using koji. So this was not a new technology in Japan. And clearly Takamine knew about it from his mother's family. And it's not too much to say that without koji, Japanese cuisine would not exist as we know it. Japanese drinks would not exist as we know it. The two national drinks of Japan are sake and shochu. And then, of course, there's Okinawa and Awamori, which is now part of Japan. Okinawa used to be an independent country. But koji is used to make miso and mirin and soy sauce. It's used to make pickles. It's actually a meat tenderizer because the koji can actually even work on meat. And Takamine figured out how to make it a digestive aid. And so koji has actually been designated the national mold of Japan. You know that the Japanese take their mold seriously when they actually designate a national mold. So that's the importance of koji in Japan. It cannot be overstated just how important this ingredient is in Japanese cuisine. So how does koji work? What is it really doing? We know it breaks the starches into sugars, but that's a simplified version. So koji mold is grown on steamed rice, usually, or another starch base. So you could use barley, you could use wheat, you could use oats, anything that's a starch like that. And as it's eating into the grain, it is creating amylase and protease, as well as other byproducts, including umami, which is a key point to what koji does. Koji really creates a lot of umami, so a lot of depth of flavor. And the koji amylase breaks down complex carbohydrates, or the starches, while the protease would be breaking down proteins, and that's why koji works as a meat tenderizer. So it can actually work in both ways. Now, wait a minute, there's koji amylase again. We look back to that article from 1891, koji amylase, starch-eating, his patented diastase starch-eating koji amylase. But here it says he patented the new process in Europe and America. Having studied Japanese patent law, having studied American patent law on his honeymoon, and having worked in the patent office in Japan, he realized he could patent Japanese traditional fermentation methods as novel technologies in the West. And he did so. He patented the use of koji in the US and in several European countries. So he clearly had a good head on his shoulders for business. So just again, koji eats starches, it generates heat and sugar, and the yeast eat that sugar to make alcohol. So that's where whiskey comes into this. Part of the reason that his mother-in-law had invited the family back was that she had met Joseph Greenhut. Now, most of us probably have never heard of Joseph Greenhut. I certainly had not before I started to do research for my book. And it was really during the writing of my book that I discovered the Takamine story, and I'm really, really happy that I could share it with you here today. It's just a very small block of text in my book, but there's so much more to his life than I even realized at that time. Now, Greenhut was the president of the Illinois Whiskey Trust, which was the largest spirits maker in America at that time. And where were most of their distilleries? Peoria, Illinois. That's why they ended up settling there, because his mother-in-law, Takamine's mother-in-law, had offered an introduction to Joseph Greenhut. So to set context, as the largest producer of alcohol in the States at the time, they had 65 distilleries under one umbrella company, and they made 80% of American spirits at that time in the late 1800s. Huge, huge concern. And so more press for Takamine just a few months after his koji amylase story comes out. This in the Chicago Daily Tribune on Thursday, September 24th, 1891, and I'm pointing that out for a reason. Takamine has been here personally conducting the experiment, and basically they realized that it was possible to use the Takamine process, which is what it was called, rather than koji fermentation, in order to reduce the cost of whiskey, because koji is more efficient than malting. So malting barley, which is the traditional way of making whiskey and beer, is actually a less efficient way of extracting sugars than what koji does. In a koji fermentation, the rice or the barley or whatever you're growing the koji on will completely liquefy those grains over time. But these are also longer fermentations, so it's a trade-off. Whiskey fermentations are relatively short. Sake, shochu, and awamori fermentations are quite long, but the resulting product, you can get a higher yield of alcohol at the end. So, sorry, that was September 24th, 1891. October 8th, 1891, 2 weeks after that article was published in the Chicago Tribune, the Manhattan distillery, where Takamine was conducting his experiments, burnt to the ground overnight. How this happened was never resolved. Who did it was never discovered, but it was clearly an act of arson, and it's believed to have been the maltsters. So the people responsible for making the malt that would supply grain to the whiskey, or supply sugars to the whiskey, probably were not happy to learn that they were going to be undercut by this upstart Japanese businessman. Now, clearly this was a financial decision by whoever built the distillery down, but the fact that it was a Japanese businessman or Japanese chemist who was doing this work probably played into their decision making in some way. And you can see his name is misspelled one more time in this article as Takimine. So as I said, that would be a continued problem for him. However, not to be dissuaded, remember this is someone who was traveling all over Japan before travel was much of a thing in Japan. One of the first Japanese people to study overseas in Scotland, had that trip to New Orleans, decided to marry an American woman. He really, he was ambitious. He was doing everything he could to be successful. And so 3 years after that distillery fire, the Manhattan distillery had been rebuilt. Fortunately, the Illinois Whiskey Trust had plenty of resources to do that, to rebuild a destroyed distillery. And the Takamine process starts production officially in December of 1894. So Takamine's whiskey is finally realized. And to set context, I had mentioned Masataka Taketsuru earlier. He is rightly considered the father of Japanese whiskey. He helped build the Yamazaki distillery for Suntory, and he later founded the Nikka company, which is Suntory's chief rival. And Taketsuru had gone to Scotland specifically to learn how to make whiskey, and he started to do so in 1919. He was doing apprenticeships at whiskey distilleries in Scotland. 25 years earlier, Takamine was in charge of production of whiskey in America. But he was doing it in the States. He never took this technology back to Japan. He never started making whiskey back in Japan because his life was in the States. But it's really interesting that this style of koji fermented whiskey was being produced 25 years before Taketsuru even started to learn how to make malt whiskey in Scotland. The story doesn't necessarily end well, which is probably why we don't know Takamine as a whiskey maker today. In February, so just 3 months after they begin production, the Manhattan Distillery and the Illinois Whiskey Trust go into receivership due to a federal lawsuit, and the distillery is shuttered. So production ceases just 3 months later. And this is because 5 years earlier, the Sherman Antitrust Act had been implemented by Congress. And what do we have? We have the Illinois Whiskey Trust. They put trust right in the name of the company. And as I said, they were making 80% of all spirits in the United States. That's clearly a massive, massive economic interest. And Joseph Greenhut was fond of market manipulation. In fact, he was using these Takamine stories to drive up or drive down the stock share prices and manipulating markets. So clearly unfair trading practices by this very large company. And actually, the Sherman Antitrust Act was really not used almost at all in the first 12 years of its existence. It was kind of a paper dragon. It didn't really have teeth. One big exception was the Whiskey Trust. They decided to go after the Whiskey Trust because they were doing so much market manipulation and they were such a large percentage of a very important industry. And so the distilleries get shut down. Takamine ends up suing the Whiskey Trust for breach of contract. But during this lawsuit, he actually, his liver disease comes back in a big way. Who knows if it was due to stress or something else. And he ends up requiring surgery, and his wife nurses him back to health over a long convalescence. And it's interesting, I was not able to find what happened with that lawsuit, whether or not he was ever compensated for this, or if it was decided to just throw the case out. Now, he was not an American citizen, and he could not legally become an American citizen at this time. So his legal standing in court may have been tenuous at best, but he tried. So the new owners of the Manhattan distillery decide to revert to malting. They decide to go back to the less efficient way, and Takamine's Koji whiskey is lost to history. We have no idea what happened to the liquid in those barrels that were made in those 3 months, probably blended into other products and sold to the public without any recognition of what was in the bottle, which is unfortunate because except for this trust busting and the timing of what happened, this could have been an established style of American whiskey well over 100 years ago, but for this accident of history. Now, there is good news. There's a silver lining. There actually is now a Takamine whiskey, and this was developed at the Shinozaki Distillery in Fukuoka, Japan, who have revived the Takamine process. Now, Shinozaki goes back into the 1800s making sake. They're a sake-making family, and they started distilling spirits in the 1970s. And when the son of the current president, Michiaki Shinozaki, learned the Takamine whiskey story about the fact that Jokichi Takamine, who he learned about in school for other reasons, had actually tried to make whiskey in America using koji fermentation, he decided he wanted to try to make that style. Now they had experience with distillation and with koji fermentation, but they'd never made whiskey, and they didn't have casks. They didn't have a barrel aging warehouse. They didn't have any of the other things they would need to make a whiskey. So over about a 20-year period, Michiaki convinced his father to start investing, and they acquired a barrel aging warehouse. They acquired, at this point, it's in speaking to them, I think it's over nearly 2,000 casks in this warehouse, which for someone who's used to making sake and traditional Japanese shochu is an enormous investment. With whiskey, it takes time, right? You can make Japanese shochu or sake and sell it pretty soon after you've made it. And in Japan, alcohol is taxed at the time of production. When you actually put something into a storage tank and are ready to bottle it, that's when you're taxed. So to make whiskey in Japan is a very heavy economic burden because you need to pay your tax on that distillate before you age it. And if you're aging a whiskey for 5, 10, 15 years, you're just sitting on that tax money you've already spent. And you have the angel share. The spirit is evaporating in those barrels. So you're going to pay a higher percentage of tax on what you end up bottling. But Michiaki and his family decided that this was worth the effort and worth the expense. And so they revived this Takamine process. They learned how to make this whiskey. And the Takamine family trust was so happy for what Shinozaki had decided to do that they've given permission to use the Takamine name and likeness for a commercial product for the first time since the trust was established. And so now that Takamine's experiment has finally been realized, this is actually making waves in the whiskey industry. and has people buzzing about it in Japan and hopefully in the States. So, of course, this did not help Jokichi Takamine. Getting back to our main story, he went back to work. Once he recovered from his illness, his surgery, he had to get back to work and figure out something else to do. So fortunately, again, he had patented koji amylase in 1891. At just the age of 36, he got this patent for koji amylase. And in 1894, so just before his whiskey production started, he and his in-laws had actually established the International Takamine Company. Originally, it had been the Takamine Ferment Company, and then they created a new company in 1894. And you can see there that the founders were Jokichi himself, along with his mother-in-law and his father-in-law. And this was focused on this takadiastase medicine, which he had developed using koji amylase. And less than a year later, he licenses this takadiastase stomach aid. This is something that helps you with digestion, because remember, koji can break down proteins and break down starches. So anything that's bothering you that you've eaten, koji may be able to help. They licensed it to the Parke-Davis Company, which at the time was one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States. And this made him clearly independently wealthy, and they were able to move to New York City. They left Chicago behind, and he opened a laboratory in Harlem to continue his experiments and continue to try to develop new medicines and new technologies. And he, again, extremely ambitious, he decides to establish a company in Japan as the import company for his takadiastase. So koji-based medicine is being made in the United States and exported to Japan. So there's this boomerang effect. And Sankyo Shoten is the company that he founds. And today, it is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in Japan. This is another part of Jokichi Takamine's legacy. And just a year later, after he starts that company in Japan, in his laboratory in Harlem, he isolates adrenaline. It cannot be overstated how important this is in the history of medicine. This is a landmark moment in which the first pure hormone in history is isolated. So not only is he able to isolate adrenaline and turn it into a medical treatment, which is still being used today, he's taught others how to isolate hormones using his methods. So it's a hugely important moment in medical history, and it's done by a Japanese chemist who had some medical training but was not a physician, in a lab in Harlem after he'd failed at making whiskey in Peoria, Illinois. So such an interesting series of events that happened in just a short time. Remember, he started making his whiskey in 1894. They went to production. Here we are 6 years later, and he's isolated adrenaline. I'm not sure that people could do this sort of thing today. And again, he had licenses that adrenaline to Parke-Davis Company, and he makes another fortune. He becomes an extremely, extremely wealthy man at this time, probably the most successful Japanese businessman outside of Japan in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And he turns toward philanthropy. He really doesn't have any more significant breakthroughs in his research after isolating adrenaline, probably because he became so comfortable and he realized that there was more to life than spending untold hours in his laboratory and ignoring his family and his community. And so in 1905, at the age of 50, he establishes the Nippon Club in Manhattan. So this is the age of private clubs in New York City. And as we know, a lot of those clubs were segregated, but there were also a lot of Japanese businessmen doing business in New York at this time. So he established his own private club for these Japanese businessmen. And in the photo on the right, that's actually the Japanese prince's banquet for when he visited New York. And there were, I believe, two former presidents, United States presidents, as well as other dignitaries from the American government present at that dinner at the Nippon Club. And now another thing that happened is in 1904, there was the St. Louis World's Fair. So you remember he met his wife at the 1884 World's Fair. So 20 years later, there's a Japanese pavilion at the St. Louis World's Fair, and they built a Japanese home on the site of the World's Fair in St. Louis. And when the fair ended, that Japanese home was given to Jokichi Takamine, and he moved that house to upstate New York. And the home is called Shofuden, and it still exists today. This became his family's summer retreat in upstate New York. In 1909, the family moves into a 6-story Manhattan townhouse. This was the former home of the Nippon Club. The Nippon Club had moved out and the family moved in. But this is simply to give you a sense of the wealth that he had accumulated, how successful he was financially, that he could live in a 6-story Manhattan townhouse with his family. That's difficult for anyone to do in any era, clearly, but for this son of a samurai, one of 13 children from essentially rural central Japan, to end up here is really a remarkable journey. And you were probably wondering where cherry blossoms came into this. Jokichi Takamine was actually responsible for donating the cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C. This was one of his last great acts of philanthropy. He didn't want credit for this, so he negotiated an intermediary with the Japanese embassy, I believe, and donated the cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C. He also donated trees to Columbia University and the park around Grant's tomb on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I believe other places around the country. He really, really cared deeply about American-Japanese relations and what that these two countries could have a lasting friendship. And these were the things he was doing later in life to try to achieve that goal. And a little bit later in life, he's still doing he's got the Nippon Club, he's worked to get these cherry blossom trees donated, but he is winding down. He's starting to slow down, but he's starting to also be recognized. He's inducted into the Imperial Academy in Japan for his work on adrenaline. And in 1915, he receives the Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese Emperor, which is the highest honor that can be given to a civilian by the emperor. The fact that he was given this for work he did overseas is pretty remarkable. He spent his entire adult life, basically, from the age of about 30 on, or 30, maybe 33, 34 onward, he was living in the United States. He never repatriated to Japan. So to receive that honor is really remarkable. And unfortunately, due to his liver problems, and then he ended up developing kidney disease, he passes away in 1922 at the age of 67, still a relatively young man. And if he had stayed healthy longer and had been able to continue his work in trying to improve American and Japanese relations, maybe we don't go to war 18 years later, but we'll never know. Caroline had him laid to rest in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where he is still today. And that's the life of Japanese chemist and philanthropist, Dr. Jokichi Takamine. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk today, and I hope that you've enjoyed my comments. And I think now we can move on to questions.
Fantastic, Stephen. Thank you very much for that. That was every time you tell me more about Takamine, I learn something new, and it's remarkable. Remarkable has been used a lot today, but I think is there a stronger word than remarkable? Jokichi Takamine really did affect everyone and everything that he could possibly think of while he was moving around the world. And it's just amazing to realize that this was happening in the 1890s. He was moving to Scotland, and he was all over Japan, and then he came to the States a few times, and just mind-blowing ambition and talent all in a single package. So anyways, thanks again for that really interesting and inspiring talk on Jokichi Takamine. We have some some very interesting comments and questions in the Q&A, and I would encourage anybody who has things that they want to ask to Stephen. I'm going to be curating a list of things to lob in his direction. So you'll be hearing my voice, but Stephen's going to be brought back to the fore in a second. I think one thing that might be really interesting to hear more about is the whiskey itself. There's been a few different questions about Jokichi's interest in whiskey. Is there any indication when he might have started? I mean, he clearly wouldn't have known whiskey from his time in Japan because Taketsuru hadn't made it to Scotland yet. But does it really seem like he became interested in whiskey through his introduction to the Whiskey Trust by his mother-in-law? Is that really the beginning of it, or was there anything that could have introduced him to whiskey earlier?
I think that's a great question. He did spend over 3 years in Scotland, so it's entirely possible that he had been exposed to that. We really don't know much about his private life. We don't know whether or not he enjoyed alcohol regularly. We don't know what he did with his free time. It doesn't seem like he had a lot of free time. He was notorious for working long and late hours in his laboratory all the time. And so he might have been exposed to whiskey in Scotland. He certainly would not have been exposed to it in Japan that early. But I think he probably saw it as a business opportunity. I think he saw how he could take the sake fermentation methods he probably learned from his mother's family and apply them to Western spirits. He's obviously very creative guy. He could come up with new solutions to problems that he discovered, and it interested him. And I have a feeling there was a pretty large financial incentive to be in business with a company that's covering 80% of the domestic spirits production in the United States.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was great answer. Yeah, I hadn't considered the Scotland connection, and I think it's that's a very probable explanation that he knew a bit about whiskey before making his way to the United States. That was a question from Maurice. Maurice, thank you for your question. And related again to the whiskey, this is from Lucas. Lucas, thank you for your comment and question. He says, since Takamine whiskey uses rice and koji instead of malt, is Takamine whiskey gluten-free? So 2 parts to that, rice and then gluten-free.
Sure. So actually, I'm sorry I didn't explain clearly. The Takamine whiskey, the new expression that's been released by the Shinozaki distillery, actually is made with 100% barley. So from a someone who's gluten intolerant, they might feel a risk of that. I am not a medical doctor, but my understanding is distilled spirits do not have gluten in them, or if they do, they have trace amounts that shouldn't really bother somebody. The distillation process, first of all, you've got the starches breaking down the sugar. I'm sorry, let me step back. You have the koji breaking down the starches. So as I understand gluten intolerance, it has to do with these long starch chains being difficult to digest. The koji's done that job for you. It's broken those starches down. Plus distillation, you've got a completely different product at the end, regardless of what the base ingredient was. Again, I'm not a physician. Consult your doctor before you drink barley-based distillates if you have a gluten intolerance.
Excellent. Okay, so it's 100% barley. So in that sense, it is like a lot of whiskey made around the world. It's a barley spirit. In what other ways, and I'm just kind of thinking about the juxtaposition of American style whiskey as we know it today, and this other style of whiskey, this koji whiskey that could have been American whiskey, if not for you didn't say the word, but I'm going to say it. If it wasn't for the arson in 1891 on October 8th, then this might actually have become what American whiskey is, or at least a subcategory of it. So what are the differences if somebody's tasting a koji whiskey versus a bourbon or a rye whiskey or a regular malt whiskey made from barley? What are some of the differences that we can expect to taste? A
great question. I think the key difference with the koji versus malting. So malting is the predominant style of Scotch whiskey production, and malted grains are common, and you're basically tricking the grains into releasing their sugars. They think they're about to sprout, and then you kill them. But as they think they're about to sprout, they're creating the sugar to feed themselves as they grow into plants. And then you extract those sugars. For me, the key difference is that umami component that comes through from a koji fermentation. Now, obviously, bourbon's made from predominantly corn. Rye is made from predominantly rye. So those are going to express differently than a barley fermentation. Another difference is that in order to grow koji on a grain, you need to remove the outer husks. You need to polish the grain. And because you're removing the fats and proteins that are on the outside of the grain, which is the shell and the bran, you are going to end up with a cleaner distillate than you would from a malted distillate. So that is another way that I think it's going to express itself. I think you're going to get a little bit of umami, and it's going to be a little bit cleaner, a little bit, I don't know if lighter is the right word, but I think it's not, some whiskeys can express with a lot of funk, and I don't think you're going to get that funk from a koji-based whiskey.
Okay, so it's a more balanced, perhaps, expression. The koji helps to smooth a lot of things out. I mean, one thing that's very interesting, maybe this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, so let's try and be careful not to go too far down it. One thing that often surprises when you think of a whiskey still, the machine that is used to turn a non-distilled, what is essentially a beer, into a whiskey, that machine in Scotland, I'm sure everyone has seen photos of it. If you haven't, please Google it, but they're often made of copper. Am I right?
That's right.
And the still used at Shinozaki Brewery and Distillery in Fukuoka, Japan, that's not made of copper at all. And can you tell us how is that still distinct, and why are they able to use something? Why do people use copper normally, and why do they not have to in Fukuoka?
That's a very deep question for this.
Sorry, danger.
Curveball. So copper is used because it removes a sulfur compound that expresses in malt distillate. And so it makes it an easier drink to consume. You don't get the smell of essentially rotten eggs. But those sulfur compounds are concentrated in that outer husk of the grain. So when you use a stainless steel still, which is predominant in Japanese shochu and awamori production, the stainless steel stills do not end up imparting that sulfur, expressing that sulfur the way that it would for a whiskey distillation, again, because you removed the outer husks of the grains. And the reason that Japanese stills tend to be stainless is for efficiency and for reliability. Those are like Toyotas, right? While the copper stills are like Ferraris. They might be beautiful, but they don't always work. So they're very temperamental. Copper is a softer metal. So the stainless stills tend to be used in Japan. And again, as I mentioned, these shochu makers, these traditional Japanese craft spirits makers, they don't necessarily have a lot of resources, and they're selling their product soon after they make it because it's going to be taxed immediately. So they do not necessarily invest in the copper stills. It's changing a little bit. There are some copper stills in some shochu distilleries, but it's still the exception. And I do know that Shinozaki actually has now announced that they will begin making malt whiskey from this fall, and they will have copper stills installed, I believe, next month. So things are changing. But I really, we're talking about this one Takamine koji whiskey, but I really hope that this is the first of many. I hope this results in a revival of this style, both in Japan and in the States. I would love for an American whiskey maker to start making koji whiskey. I think it's the tip of the iceberg. I think it's just a tremendous untapped opportunity for whiskey around the world to use this alternative fermentation method, which again is more efficient than malting. So I'm really curious to see what's going to happen. I think these are early days.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic if this comes back to life in the United States. And we know that some distilleries around the world are using koji. One thing that you got into in your presentation, and this was a comment from Sherry in the questions section, food, koji and food. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to see koji on menus. A lot of chefs are starting to experiment with it. Can you expound on this a little bit? What ways is koji finding its way into, outside of Japan, the cuisine that people are enjoying today?
Great question. American chefs, and I think European chefs as well, have started to discover koji as a cooking aid. And there's ways to essentially do a koji brine of your fried chicken, of the chicken before you fry it to make fried chicken. And it's a meat tenderizer, so the chicken gets so soft, and you end up just getting, it's a really, really delicious way of enjoying fried chicken. But that's just, again, one way to use it. I know that in there's an interesting story in Cleveland, Ohio, in a fine dining restaurant, there was the head chef wanted to make miso. He wanted to make his own miso. So he told one of his line cooks, a fellow named Jeremy Umansky, who's now written a book called Koji Alchemy. Actually, Jeremy's life changed because of this one conversation with his head chef. His head chef said, "Go learn how to make miso. I want to make miso here in the restaurant." So Jeremy goes off, does all the research, figures out how to use koji to sacrifice the grains to make the miso. And in the experiments that he's doing in the kitchen, he ends up leaving some koji in a refrigerator on a shelf above some raw scallops. Some of the koji inoculates the scallops. They come back into the restaurant after a couple of days off, and the scallops have a white mold coating over them. But scallops are not cheap ingredients, so they decide to fry them up and eat them. And they cannot believe how good they are. Mm. So this is when he realized that not only could you use it to sacrifice grains, and it was known that you could use it to break down proteins, but the koji tenderized and umamified, it accentuated the umami of the scallops. Mm. And that sent Jeremy down an entire rabbit hole where now he makes charcuterie. He fast ages charcuterie, so like Italian dried meats, using koji. And he can do in a few weeks what it would take months to do in the old style. So it's just scratching the surface of how koji is going to be used in cuisine overseas, and it's already used in cuisine all the time in Japan. So just a really, really interesting ingredient, and I think I would not be surprised at all if a decade from now you're seeing koji on menus all over the country.
What are some ways that, yeah, koji, it's magic nearly. I mean, it's used in it. We saw the taka diastase. It was used as a digestive aid. In what ways do normal Japanese families use koji in their cooking? Like just everyday cooking here in Japan. If you didn't realize, folks that are watching this, Stephen and I are both in Japan right now. I'm in Tokyo, he's in Fukuoka. So how do people cook with it here?
Well, it's in every pantry, not koji itself, but soy sauce is ubiquitous, obviously. Sure. Miso is ubiquitous. Mirin is ubiquitous. These are staple ingredients in every Japanese kitchen, and all of them are made with koji. Folks might not realize, but soy sauce is actually pressed miso. If you extract the liquid from miso, you have soy sauce. But it's simply used everywhere. Now, you will, as I mentioned, a very common use is to tenderize chicken before frying. It's a Japanese karaage, which is basically bite-sized pieces of boneless fried chicken. Those are often broken. A koji, a rice koji paste basically is used to cure those before you, or to brine those before you fry them. That's a very common use, but it really, because of the use of soy sauce, miso, mirin, koji is consumed by Japanese people daily in some way. And then all sake, all shochu, all awamori, those traditional Japanese drinks, all made with koji.
Rice koji being the most common.
That's right.
As you said during your presentation. Usually when when it's being propagated, to use that verb again, it's on rice. Why is rice so common for koji?
Yeah, we're in Japan.
Sure.
Rice is everywhere. And from that perspective, I'm in central Fukuoka. If I get on my bicycle and I ride 20 minutes west of here or 20 minutes south of here, I am in suburban communities, and wherever there's not a house, there's a rice paddy. It's just rice is grown all across the country. It's the primary staple crop of Japan and has been for centuries. And so and koji fermentation and sake being made from rice, rice became the first thing that they learned how to grow koji on. It was only later when they discovered they could grow it on other grains. And so now barley miso is now a product that's available,
sure,
as opposed to rice miso. And so you do see koji being grown on other substrates, but it's still predominantly rice. I think just because of the diet of Japanese people.
There was a question in the over here that I'm looking at asking about shofuden, that transplanted Japanese style home that they use, I believe, as their home away from home, their vacation or retreat. Where exactly in upstate New York is that located?
It's in Sullivan County, outside of Monticello, New York. I don't know the exact location, but I'm pretty sure if folks Google it, you'll be able to find. I'm not sure if it's open to the public right now. I believe it's owned by a Japanese businessman who's trying to figure out how he can actually repatriate it to Japan. That was the most recent article I'd read about it, but that article was probably 5 to 10 years old. So I'm not sure whatever happened to it. It does not sound like the home has been moved. But as I understand it, it's still in upstate New York.
Another question, and this is going back to the early days of Jokichi's life. This is another question from Lucas, and it is really surprising when you think about the fact that Jokichi was 10 years old when he traveled 600 miles to Nagasaki to, I don't know, start or continue his education. How did that work? Did he went by himself? Do you know if any family was with him? I mean, why 10 years old? He sounds like he's in his 30s already.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand Japan at the time, and this is speculative, there's no information at all about how he traveled, but samurai families would often have attendants or I guess servants, for lack of a better word. And so probably somebody from the household traveled with him. I doubt it was either of his parents. He was the oldest child, but there were lots of others by the time he was 10. If his mother had 13 children, clearly there was a brood at home. And also because he was sent not by the family, but by the Kaga domain lord, that maybe there might have been retainers from the Kaga domain that took him to Nagasaki. I doubt that anybody stayed with him once he was there, because he was living with a family. So most likely the family was was responsible for him. And I'm guessing that the Kaga domain vassals, I guess, would come and transport him to wherever he needed to go next when he went to Kyoto or he went to Osaka. I don't know when he became independent of their domain. It might have been around 1873 when the samurai class was abolished, because that's also when Japan modernized its governments, its municipal governments. They went from the family-run domains to the modern prefectures around the same time. And so that the disruption of the governmental system probably ended his dependence on the domain. Fortunately, he was an adult by then, and then the Japanese government took strong interest in him since he was clearly an outstanding student.
Yeah, he sounds like a genius. I'm sure he was I wish I could see 10-year-old Takamine today and see how he would fare with other 10-year-olds. Remarkable human. I got a question here that I don't know if people can see, but from Juan Carlos, he asks, do you think that koji and malt could be used together and complement each other to make an interesting whiskey?
You know, I've had the same thought. It's a great question. In my conversations with American whiskey makers and Japanese whiskey makers, it would be redundant. You don't need two different saccharification agents in the same fermentation. And the production methods are also different. So in malting, you extract the sugars in one step of the process. Then you move that wash, the liquid, you take out the residual grains and you just take the liquid, and that's when you add the yeast. In a koji fermentation, you actually grow your koji in a hot, humid environment on the grain itself. There's no water or yeast involved at that point. Then once you've got a good koji propagation, you move that into the first primary fermentation where you add water and yeast, and the koji continues to break down the grains as the yeast is converting the starches and sugars. For malting, the malting is finished before you ever add the yeast, but koji stays active in the fermentation until the end. So I don't know what would happen if you put malted grains into a koji fermentation. It'd be an interesting experiment. I hope somebody does it, but I'm not sure that you need both. Malted grains are more expensive than raw grains, and koji then is another expense. So you might just make the whiskey more expensive. I'm not sure what it would do as far as the end result product.
Do you think that koji, and I apologize because we sort of covered this already, but the koji being used in drinks, you used the word umami before. Is it? Can you talk a little bit more about that? The umami layer. I don't know how you want to describe it. That makes it distinct from other drinks. That may make it distinct from whiskey.
Yeah. Well, at least from malt whiskey, right? I think.
Yeah. Sure.
Right. The umami component. I think that's where you would end up if you use malted grains and koji saccharified grains. You would end up with a distinct drink in the sense that it would have that umami, but there's also a distinct character that comes through malting. So maybe you get a combination of the two, and maybe that's the best of both worlds. Now, I do know that there are Western spirits makers experimenting with koji. I know that Empirical Spirits in Copenhagen actually has now started to make some koji-based spirits. They're not calling it shochu because they're using malted grains, but then they're using koji actually as a flavor enhancer. They're using it for the umami. They're not using it for the sugars. So there is a recognition that koji can add flavor to these drinks in Western distilleries, which I think is really interesting development. And Empirical is extremely experimental. They're certainly at the forefront of distilleries around the world. So it'll be interesting to see how this diffuses throughout the spirits industry worldwide.
Yeah, there's also the Boss Hog whiskey, right, made by Whistle Pig. Wasn't there there may have been koji used in that fermentation as well?
Our understanding is that there is koji used in that fermentation, but we're not exactly sure what percentage of the mash bill, how it was used. There's not a lot of transparency around that specific brand. I don't really blame them. I think there were only about 250 bottles available. So
yeah, sure. They don't really need to tell us exactly how it was made. There have been a number of questions and comments in the Q&A about Takamine whiskey, the koji whiskey that you told us about. Is it available in the States? What does it taste like? Can we get it? Those sorts of things. I think I saw at least 3 comments about that. So can you kind of address all of those at once?
Yeah, so Takamine whiskey was actually released in the US earlier this year. So it is available in the United States. I don't believe it's available nationwide yet, but it is in several markets. I know it's in, let me think, New York, New Jersey, the DC area, Florida, Georgia. So I know that it's in those locations. I've seen, social media and things around it there. I believe it's now in California as well, and probably Chicago. So there's a few different places around the country. I'm sure if you Google, you can find the website for the importer and more information about where to find it. But it is available in the U.S. And as far as how it tastes, it's a whiskey, double distilled, barrel aged for, I believe, more than 8 years. And I've been fortunate enough to try it. I'm as I mentioned earlier, I have had conversations with the Shinozaki family. I've actually known them for quite some time, and was able to try Takamine, and it's it's smooth. It's got that umami depth, and it's really balanced. I'm quite impressed with it. It's got a it's a nice drink for sure. I would encourage people to try it, especially if you're a whiskey fan.
It's really, somebody commented on this in the Q&A. It really is remarkable. I keep using that word. The whole story is just kind of brain bursting, and it is remarkable yet again to think about how this koji whiskey style could have been an American style, not necessarily a Japanese style, because Japan has been so busy making shochu and awamori for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it could have been an American style. This could have spread to the rest of the world, if not for the arson on October 8th, 1891. And I read in Adam Rogers' book that there were a bunch of things that just made the whole thing clearly arson. There was, when the building was burning, the fire was very mercifully kept just to the lab that normally should have been very easy to extinguish, except that the only working fire hydrant or source of water was too far away for the number 6 company for their hose. So they had to wait for the number 4 hose company to show up, connect the hoses, and then mysteriously the pressure in that water source had been turned off.
No kidding. I did not know that part of the story.
So they whoever had decided that they were going to torch this lab, and just that lab, and not affect any other part of the business whatsoever, they really took all the steps necessary to make sure that that one specific part of the distillery was going to burn to cinders, and the rest of it would be left standing. So it was a bit of a campfire. But if it wasn't for that situation, koji might be a household word today in the United States and around the world, for that matter. Who knows? Do you think that koji has the potential to find its way to start that process now, and to find its way into everyone's lives around the world? Is there interest in this that you've seen around the States or worldwide? Are people really paying attention to it? Is there uptake into the world of restaurants and the world of drinks? What's going on?
Excellent question. I do see an increased interest among chefs, and that seems to be leading to an increased interest among bartenders. And I do think that chefs and bartenders, they're the tastemakers for how these will be experienced by consumers, by people who visit restaurants and bars. And I do think that koji is going to become a big part of that conversation. It is interesting that the arson really did, the timing of it couldn't have been worse, because if they had been producing the Takamine process, I'm not sure it would have been called koji. I think it would have been called the Takamine process whiskey. But the koji whiskey that was being made, if they had had 3 or 4 years to be producing it and start selling it, now I think the whiskey trust still would have been busted, but I'm not convinced that the new owners of the distillery would have reverted to malting, because they would have seen the success of the product that they were making.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. So I do think you're right. I think the arson is the key defining point at which this was doomed to failure, unfortunately. But hopefully, we were delayed 120 years, but maybe we can get it right this time. 125 years.
Yeah, geez. Oh man, it's such a crazy story. Bringing it back to present day, you talked about barley being used as a substrate for growing koji and how that's used in food. Can you talk a little bit about, and this is more our wheelhouse, the shochu industry, another drink that really is unknown in the States, or not known very well yet? How rice is the main substrate that's used to make most shochu, but others are used as well. Can you talk about some of the other styles of shochu that, of course, use koji to perform the sacrarification? Sure.
Shochu and awamori are required to use koji. In fact, awamori all of the grain has to be has to be exposed to koji before it goes in the fermentation. So awamori is 100% koji distillate, exclusively made from rice in Okinawa. And that actually has a WTO protection with a geographic indication for Ryukyu Awamori. And that's actually an older tradition than shochu. It was being made in Okinawa before shochu was being made in Japan. In Japan, Okinawa is now part of Japan, but historically, what was Japan? It's believed that rice shochu was the first style, essentially distilled sake. And then barley shochu came along. And then, interestingly, what's now the most popular style is made from an agricultural product that's not even from Japan, not native to Japan, and that's sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes weren't introduced to Japan until the 1700s, but it turns out they make lovely shochu. Now, the starter fermentation is still made with rice or barley koji to get that fermentation going, and then steamed or roasted sweet potatoes are added to that fermentation. And because koji is still active in the fermentation, in what's called multiple parallel fermentation, the koji can break down the starches in the potatoes to create the sugars needed for the yeasts. So those are the three predominant styles, but there is actually buckwheat. So in Japanese, that would be soba, and I'm sure many people are familiar with soba noodles. Buckwheat can be used to make shochu as well. And then there's one other relatively minor category of kokuto sugar, which is a kind of unrefined or very lightly refined Japanese sugar from the Amami Islands that is used to make shochu there. Again, you have to use a rice koji starter fermentation, and then you add the sugar to the secondary fermentation. And then there are actually another probably close to 50 ingredients that could be used for shochu, but those represent just a tiny sliver of the market, probably less than 1%. But the main styles are rice, barley, sweet potato, soba, and kokuto sugar.
Okay, so basically, as you said during the presentation, without koji, you don't have shochu, you don't have awamori, you don't have sake, and of course you don't have koji whiskey, which it had a little bit of they hit the pause button on that style's genesis, but maybe it's been restarted. One great comment from Lucas in the Q&A, he said, with such specific details to make that arson a success, it almost sounds like an inside job. And that is a fantastic comment. Who knows? Yeah. So let's see. Here's a question. Is koji being made in the US?
I know that, for example, I mentioned Jeremy Umansky earlier. I know that there are a number of home fermenters across the US that have taken koji spores. So basically, you can buy commercial koji spores from Japanese koji makers. These are companies that are completely devoted to making different kinds of koji. We haven't even gotten into that, and that's maybe
that's another rabbit hole.
That might be another one of these in the future. But there are several different kinds of koji, and these koji makers specialize in growing koji for commercial uses. And so Jeremy and others in the States have acquired koji spores from Japan and have begun their own cultivation. And so there is this in home fermentation groups across the United States, there is koji being grown, but to my knowledge, there is no commercial koji production happening currently. But actually, I know in Japanese supermarkets or Asian markets around the country, you can find, actually it comes in a yogurt tub, and it is koji rice. And this is what people will use to either make amazake, which is a sweet, non-alcoholic, almost sake-like drink, a rice brewed beverage that people can make at home, or to do that koji fermentation or koji brining for their chicken and that sort of thing. So that is available. And I believe that actually, it might be made by a US company. I don't know the specifics, but if you visit your local Asian supermarket, you very likely can find that.
Yeah, at least there are distributors for the koji that are selling to regular consumers these days. If you were, sorry, I'm asking you to explain to us how to cook with koji. If you were to get a tub of the stuff and you were going to use it with chicken, for instance, which is delicious, how would you prepare the chicken with the rice koji or the shio koji or whatever you're using?
Well, so you just said the key words there, shio koji. So shio koji is a salt koji mix. It's actually a different product than the one I described. And you can sometimes find that. And that I would use shio koji to brine the chicken. I would basically slather that on the chicken, let it rest for a few hours before, battering it and frying it. But going from the koji, the tub of dry koji rice that you find in the supermarket, to brining the chicken would take several more steps, and I don't believe I've ever done that myself. So I'm not going to hazard a guess.
So the key point is to purchase shio koji, which I believe is also available in some markets in the US. Am I right?
As far as I remember, yes.
Shio being SHIO, or salt in Japanese, salt koji. So that might be something to experiment with at home. We're running out of time here. We've only got a few more minutes. Stephen, can you reintroduce your book just so that people know what you mentioned it at the top of the hour? Maybe you can show people what it looks like, and tell people where they can get it.
So this is my book, The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks, which I wrote with another Christopher. I'm sorry, Christopher.
Not this one. No.
Chris Bunting, who's actually a resident of the UK. And this is intended as an introductory guide to all of the various styles of alcohol being made in Japan. It does dive into the history of alcohol, both consumption and production, historically in Japan. It goes into sake, shochu, awamori, the Okinawan spirit, as well as umeshu and other fruit liqueurs, which are made in Japan. So umeshu is often referred to as plum wine. It's not a wine, just like sake is not a rice wine. Sake is closer to beer. And then that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is Western spirits being made in Japan, or Western Japanese interpretations of Western alcohols. So whiskey, wine, beer, and there's actually another chapter on cocktails. And then lots of other information. It's available on Amazon as well as through lots of local booksellers. And it's coffee table book size. It's got lots of photography. People have really been impressed with it, I think. It was nominated for a James Beard Award, which I was shocked by as my first book. But yes, please pick it up. I actually think it's a bargain. I think it's around $20 US. So I get less royalties, but you get a cheaper book. So.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's an absolute must of a resource for people who are looking to learn a little bit more about all of the drinks that are made in Japan. I know the first half is Japanese indigenous drinks, sake, shochu, awamori. Second half is traditions that have been brought to Japan from other parts of the world. It's an irreplaceable resource, and something that you can always go back to and read that little section again and refresh your memory about how these drinks are made, what makes them unique, what makes them delicious. And I think we're just about out of time. So thank you once again, Stephen. Fantastic, very illuminating presentation that I think people are going to want to rewatch several times. And you're right, we're just scratching the surface here, folks. There's so much more in store from Japan and this magical koji mold that is starting to, I don't use the word spread because it sounds sinister or dangerous. It is the magic behind some of Japan's best kept secrets. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christopher. I really enjoyed the conversation, chatting with you as always. And again, thank you very much to the JICC for the opportunity. And I hope everyone enjoyed listening. Please enjoy your koji however you like. Eat it, drink it, that sort of thing. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And this has been a lot of fun.